think if there's any period in history that I could have been alive apart from this one, and this is by far the best, I think, but if there was a period in history, it would have been 16th, early 17th century Europe. And that's on the condition, of course, that I was, relatively wealthy and male, of course, and relatively well educated. It was just such an exciting period of history, I think. All the Newton and Kepler and Giordano Bruno and all those guys were all around at that time. It's been a fantastically rich period of time. Just to see the end of that period of alchemy and the beginning of the period of science, if you like, and all the fantastic, sometimes called paradigm shifts, which took place at that time. One of the things that I find quite interesting about that time, actually, is to do with authority, actually, because I think it was a unique period in human history and cultural history in relation to authority. Because of course, there was proto-science before that, and there was all kinds of ways of finding things out prior to the 16th, early 17th century. But the predominant way of gaining authority, it seems to me, for anything you might know prior to that time, was through some kind of transcendent process, really through some religious or theological process. The authorship of the facts and the truths that you held to be self-evident lay ultimately with the deity, I think, or with some kind of supernatural power. The things that you knew to be true were authorized by a transcendent force, a god perhaps. And although that seems very different to the period of history we're in now, I'm not sure it is that different. Because one of the things that I find quite interesting about what happened beyond that is what's sometimes called the mathematization of science. People like Klein have written quite well about this, about how science, particularly as it developed in the 20th century, is increasingly dominated by maths. And that which is fine, and it's incredibly powerful, incredibly predictive and so on. But what happens as a result of that is the authority for the truths that you find out through much science these days is also kind of transcendent. I say kind of because there are some qualifications to place on that, in that you can't appeal to common sense. Many of the findings of modern science make no appeal to common sense at all, or are counterintuitive, and they don't make any appeal to the senses because they lie far beyond the range of the senses. And yet in some sense, because they have such predictive power, they are in some sense true, but the truth is authorized by the kind of quasi-transcendent status of mathematics ultimately. So I think it's, the knowledge, if you like, was authorized through transcendence of God prior to the 16th century, and in the current times it's authored through the transcendence of mathematics. But I think there was a period of time, which is this period of time I'm interested in, the 16th, 17th century, when for a while there, I think man was the measure of all things for a while there. When Newton was coming up with the various laws of motion, and when Descartes was working out certain versions of space, and certain understandings of thought, the appeal that they were making wasn't to any kind of transcendent authority in the modern or the ancient sense. It was an appeal to a kind of common sense. It was an appeal to experimentation done on human scale, experimentation which appealed to the human sensorium and the evidence of one's eyes and one's ears and one's abilities to work the machinery and take the readings off the machinery and do the experiments. It was this little human moment, I think, in between these two transcendent states, ancient and modern. Phoebe, come here. Come on. I should just qualify that, or just qualify the qualification. When I was saying that contemporary, the kind of authoritative appeals that contemporary science makes when it appeals to maths is quasi-transcendent, because I don't think it is transcendent in the same way. The transcendent quality of maths, as I understand it, and I may be way off the beam here, is lies in not in some kind of ethereal, kind of Platonic notion of transcendence, but in a kind of sense of universality, and well, it's ultimately embodied, but it uses the language of embodiment and extends the sense of the senses to a point where it's not exactly, it's certainly not transcendent in the same way, that you're not making appeals to the same kinds of absolutes, but you are making appeals to universals, I think.